May the 28th, 1940. After only 18 days of fighting, the Allied armies in Europe have been smashed by the Nazis. A German invasion of Britain now looks inevitable. The 5 men of the British War Cabinet consider their options. The former Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, are arguing for peace talks with the Nazis. This seems entirely sensible. Britain might hang on to her independence and most of the empire. Winston Churchill has been Prime Minister just 2.5 weeks. He is contemptuous. Hitler would reduce Britain to a slave state with a puppet government. Labour's Clement Attlee backs Churchill. His deputy, Arthur Greenwood, a figure forgotten in history, is with them too. And so the decision is made: Britain will fight on. Churchill then calls together the full cabinet. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, he says, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood on the ground. There's a pause, a great roar. People are in tears. This is a blood pact, drawing in not only the men in the room, but everybody. Britannia, the old conqueror island, isn't going to go down easily. Stand together, fight to the end. It's 10 past midnight on Monday the 27th of May 1940, and the telephone is ringing at the home of a chartered accountant called Basil Smith. It's the Admiralty calling. Operation Dynamo is underway. Basil Smith set off for the boathouse where his 24-foot motor launch, Constant Nymph, was moored. Everything unnecessary, china, cutlery, pots and pans, had already been stripped out and stored. He was just waiting for his naval permit. He said the officer in charge didn't seem to think there was any tremendous hurry. Across the Channel, the British and French armies, hundreds of thousands of men, were in full retreat, and their only chance of escape was by sea. German bombers were trying to close down the nearest port, still held by the Allies, Dunkirk. After a 20-mile march, Private Fred Barker and his platoon clambered to the top of the sand dunes. We stood stock still in astonishment, he said. There were lines and lines of thousands of men, all waiting to be evacuated.
Suddenly, some of the men around him were seized by panic and began to run down the beach towards any boat they could see. Their officer roared at them to stop. Stand fast, form ranks, he shouted. But more men began desperately to run down the beach. The officer then pulled his revolver and threatened to shoot the next man who broke the line. Basil Smith was now heading out to sea with a full tank of fuel and a crew of 2 naval ratings. 4 months in the Navy, never been to sea, took to it like ducks to water. But what it was they were actually going to be doing, he had no idea. Whatever it was,
He'd been assured by the pleasant-voiced man from the Admiralty it would be dangerous. The men on the Dunkirk beaches could only be reached by the shallowest craft.
Thousands were standing here in rows, 4 deep, waiting day and night to be rescued. And when the tides came in, they were up to their necks in water. One young private said he counted 3 tides. We had to keep our cigarettes and matches in our helmets to keep them dry, said another. It was blazing hot, and we had nothing to drink.
The little ships were coming to the rescue. A motley flotilla of hundreds of yachts, cockle boats, fishing smacks and pleasure cruisers, with names like the Richmond, the Resolute and Queen Boadicea, and no fewer than 11 boats called the Skylark. Basil Smith reached Dunkirk at dusk. Strafed by fighter planes, the little ships and hundreds of rowing boats tirelessly ferried exhausted men from the beaches to the larger ships waiting to take them home. Under heavy shelling, men fell overboard, some were crushed to death, many drowned. Constant Nymph helped to get around 900 soldiers off the beach before she had to be abandoned. Basil Smith sailed home on a merchant ship, still under heavy fire.
Plenty of hot tea and bread and butter and jam, and a chance to light a pipe made me perfectly indifferent to anything Jerry did. Basil Smith had just defined the spirit of Dunkirk.
Over 9 days, the flotilla of 900 naval and civilian craft rescued over 1/3 men from the beaches of northern France. It was a resounding military defeat, but it was also a kind of miraculous deliverance. On Tuesday, the 4th of June, Winston Churchill turned the Dunkirk spirit into a founding legend of modern Britain.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The British Empire now stood alone against the might of the German military machine. But who was the we Churchill spoke of? Who was British and who wasn't? As darkness fell on the 10th of June 1940, Italian ice cream shops and cafes were attacked during riots in Edinburgh, Manchester and London.
Mussolini had just joined forces with Hitler. Britain was now at war with Germany and Italy. There were 18,000 Italians registered as living in Britain, and when he was asked what should be done about them, Churchill replied, "Collar the lot."
Within 2 weeks, 4,000 Italians were rounded up. Most of them ended up in hastily organised internment camps.
To be interned in Britain is like paradise when compared with a Nazi concentration camp, so there shouldn't be any complaints here, even if the internees have literally to make their own beds and take in each other's washing.
The final destination for many Italians was the Isle of Man. They were fenced in with barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards, interned in parades of Victorian guest houses. Almost all of the Italians who were interned had done nothing more threatening to national security than to introduce the British to ice cream, olive oil, and coffee you could actually drink. George Orwell complained that you couldn't get a decent meal in London because the head chefs of the Savoy, the Café Royal, and the Piccadilly had all been locked up. But it wasn't just Italians. Over 10,000 men and women of Italian, German, and Austrian origin were interned here. One refugee said, "Put Viennese people together for long enough and they will do two things: found a university and open a patisserie." And that's just what they did here. There were cake shops, there were language lessons in French, Portuguese, Hebrew and Italian, lectures in history and literature, workshops from great Berlin theatre directors. For a short period of time, one of the great centres of European intellectual life was the Isle of Man. By now, the Luftwaffe was preparing for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Stage 1, destroy the RAF. On the 16th of August, 1940, Winston Churchill and his Chief of Staff, General Hastings Ismay, stopped off here at RAF Uxbridge on their way to Chequers. This was 11 Group HQ Fighter Command, responsible for air defence in the southeast of England. Churchill took every chance he could get to stomp down here and watch Fighter Command in action. Each day, as the battle in the sky developed, the German attacks were plotted almost minute by minute on this giant map board. The formations of attacking aircraft were shown by wooden blocks marked with the approximate number of planes. Their course was tracked by colour-coded arrows corresponding to the room's master clock. Now, it looks very complicated, but in fact, this was a masterpiece of clarity. It's a dusty old room now, but this is really about information processing, and the truth is, we were better at it than they were. Plotting the enemy attacks day and night were members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAAFs. They were known as the Beauty Chorus. Above them was what Churchill called the dress circle. And up here, the senior commanders were playing a deadly game of chess, with the Germans taking split-second decisions about when to send squadrons up to fight. Timing was critical. Fights in the air were won by a narrow margin of advantage. So getting clear of the ground and up to the correct height for battle could mean the difference between life and death. By August 1940, squadrons could be scrambled and in the air within 90 seconds. This beautifully efficient system was masterminded by the head of Fighter Command, Sir Hugh Dowding, also known as Stuffy. If a democracy has any advantage in fighting a war, it's that some people are prepared to take on and challenge the supreme leaders. Stuffy Dowding was exactly the kind of stubborn, flinty old so-and-so, quite prepared to challenge Churchill at key moments. He'd built up Fighter Command almost from nothing in the 1930s and was fiercely protective of his men and machines. This entirely novel command and control system was his idea. They called it Dowding's system. Now, there was only one question. Would it work? At 1700 hours on the day of Churchill and Ismay's visit, radar detected 100 enemy aircraft crossing the south coast. Their target, the airfields of Fighter Command. RAF squadrons were scrambled immediately. As he watched the attacks building up on the plotting table, General Ismay, a grizzled old army hand, said he felt sick with fear. But the attacks intensified. It seemed as if the RAF had nothing left in reserve, and Churchill became absorbed by the drama. 22 British aircraft were shot down that day, 8 pilots lost. But 72 enemy aircraft were destroyed. Dowding's system was keeping the Luftwaffe at bay, and the legend of the Battle of Britain was born. As Churchill continued his journey to Chequers with General Ismay, he said, "Don't talk to me. I have never been so moved." But a few moments later, Churchill himself broke the silence. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Later that evening, when he got home, the general quoted those words to his wife, and 4 days later, in a morale-boosting speech to the House of Commons, Churchill himself used them again.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. All our hearts go out to the fighter pilots whose brilliant...
Churchill needed good words. His own position was hardly secure. One British reaction to defeat in Europe was a shift to the left, even in the strangest places. This is Osterley Park, West London. Left-wing guerrillas are in action. They're led by a revolutionary called Tom Wintringham, a veteran of the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War. Here at Osterley Park, Wintringham used his Spanish experience to build a volunteer fighting force to confront the Nazis when they arrived in England. Britain was hopelessly unprepared. Most of the army's equipment had been left behind at Dunkirk. There were just 463 tanks in the whole country. Hitler had thousands at his disposal. How would we fight back?
We want large numbers of men in Great Britain.
On the 14th of May 1940, the Secretary of State for War, Anthony Eden, broadcast an appeal for volunteers. In the next 24 hours, 250,000 men came forward.
Colonel Montmorency, who was in Calcutta in '92, emerged from his retirement for the war. He wasn't very pleased with all he heard and all he saw, but whatever he felt, he tightened his belt and organized a corps. Poor Colonel Montmorency.
To begin with, they didn't have weapons and they didn't have uniforms. Most marched with golf clubs, pickaxe handles, guns they'd carved out of wood, even pikes. The Local Defence Volunteers, or LDV, were soon known as the Look, Duck and Vanish Brigade, or the Long-Dentured Veterans. They were soon renamed the Home Guard. We know them better as Dad's Army. And they were mocked from the start.
The Minister of Supply, could you please oblige us with the Bren gun? Or failing that, a hand grenade will do. We've got some ammunition in a rather damp condition, and Major Huss has enough with us that was used at Waterloo.
Frustrated by the old boys in charge, Wintringham decided to show his men what he'd learned in Spain.
Tactics of guerrilla warfare. This one's known as the monkey crawl. Here is Ricky, the Spaniard, showing them how it's done. Here they were taught, amongst other things, methods of dealing with the dive bomber.
Wintringham also wrote a best-selling book which mixed his left-wing principles with recipes for homemade grenades and Molotov cocktails.
In some secluded rendezvous that overlooks the avenue, with someone sharing a delight, chat, this and that, and cocktails for two.
Surely more schools of this kind are needed. We all want to know the best way of handing out cocktails to unwelcome guests.
Most any afternoon.
Another member of the team was the surrealist artist and camouflage expert Roland Penrose, who had his own special mixture.
That all began with cocktails.
Soot and flour, which makes a good paste, which sticks to the face. And he enlivened his lectures with a slideshow featuring pictures of his girlfriend, the photographer and model Lee Miller, cunningly camouflaged in a variety of nude poses.
Tom Wintringham's belief that the war would bring socialism wasn't far off the mark, but his revolutionary zeal was too much for the old guard.
And just 3 months after it opened, Osterley Park was taken over by the regular army. It was a compliment of sorts, but it wasn't the same. Wintringham's dream of a people's army primed for total war was over.
The 7th of September 1940, a beautiful afternoon. At 4:15, Londoners look up and see what they've been dreading for months. Almost 1,000 German aircraft were advancing up the Thames. This flying terror stretched 20 miles wide across the sky. 600 fighter planes escorting 350 bombers.
An American journalist had heard them 20 minutes earlier over Kent. At first, we couldn't see anything, he said, but soon the noise had grown to a deep, full roar, like the faraway thunder of a giant waterfall. And then they came into view, like clouds of insects, moving northwest towards the capital.
London's docks were their main target. Warehouses and wharves were soon ablaze.
The burnt toffee smell from the Tate and Lyle sugar barges blazing on the Thames spread through the air. The firefighters called for help from all round the country. "Send all the bloody pumps you've got," said one. "The whole bloody world's on fire." They came back the next night, and the next, and the one after that. The first offensive of the London Blitz went on for 76 days and nights, broken by only one quiet night.
Up to a point, Britain was ready for this. Some public shelters had been prepared, but they proved grossly inadequate. In Spitalfields, the locals took over the vaults of the strongest building they could find.
This basement was supposed to have space for up to 5,000 people sheltering, but on the first night it opened twice that number, crammed themselves in down here. No water, no proper lighting, no ventilation, no sanitation, no privacy. It quickly became a lice-ridden, stinking underworld. And yet, in this dark and dirty chaos, something rather wonderful happened.
Street lamps aglow and news boys calling.
Someone decided to try and make the shelter work. His name was Mickey Davis, but he was better known as Mickey the Midget. He was hunchbacked and only 3 foot 3 inches tall, and he was in the shelter from the first night.
Bright-colored lights, palladium nights, and a world that was always gay.
Mickey established a democratically elected shelter committee, a penny a week levy to pay for cleaning, and a scheme to pay for free milk for the children.
Laughter and song and swing doors turning.
Soon this budding underground welfare state was being known as Mickey's Shelter, and British government officials were introducing visiting American politicians to it as a practical example of democracy, Blitz style.
In the first month of the Blitz, 250,000 Londoners lost their homes, 12,000 were badly injured, 6,000 killed. The Blitz was the first sustained attempt to break a country's morale and make it surrender by bombing its civilians. This was now a people's war, and civilians became the heroes.
We've been bombed, dive-bombed, high-level bombed, machine-gunned, been through 2 invasion scares. The last lot we had the house down about our ears. But we're still sticking it, and we're going to stick it.
But for how long? Britain badly needed help. On the morning of the 29th of August 1940, a young man hailed a cab to Euston Station to catch the boat train to Liverpool. With his luggage was a large black metal box. His name was Edward Taffy Bowen, son of a Swansea steelworker and a research scientist in the top-secret field of radar.
Taffy Bowen was off on one of the most important secret missions of the war. His metal case contained virtually every military breakthrough made by British science. It really was, in 1940, the ultimate box of tricks. And now the taxi driver insisted on tying it to the roof of the cab. No time to argue, so off they went.
Bowen was part of the Tizard mission, named after its brilliant leader, the scientist Henry Tizard. He was proposing an historic exchange of military and scientific secrets between Britain and the United States. The Americans were still officially neutral, but only they had the manufacturing power to make the weapons we needed to win the war.
Henry Tizard persuaded Churchill to let him offer up the deepest secrets of British science. In his words, everything the Americans wanted to know. And this was material the Americans didn't understand and desperately wanted. In the words of the US Army's Chief of Staff, a gold mine. But if it was a gift with a hook in it, because Churchill desperately hoped that it would help lure the Americans themselves into the war.
The most highly classified item in Taffy Bowen's box was the intriguingly named cavity magnetron. This device would revolutionize radar technology. It had the potential to help decide the outcome of the war.
At Euston Station, a porter grabbed the metal box, stuck it on his shoulder, and vanished into the rush hour crowds. Taffy Bowen was a long-distance runner, but he struggled desperately to keep an eye on this priceless cargo. At last, to his intense relief, it was safely delivered to a first-class compartment on the Liverpool train.
But they weren't safe yet. As the boat sailed for North America, Liverpool suffered one of the first nighttime bomb attacks of the war. The captain had instructions to throw the box overboard if the ship came under attack. One American historian later called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores.
Over the next 3 months, there was a wary exchange of information as the British opened their box of magic and waited to see what the Americans would offer in return. It was a kind of intellectual strip-tease. In the end, the British didn't see anything very interesting, but by then it didn't matter. Britain had virtually run out of options, and so far as most American scientists were concerned, the Tizard's mission had effectively ended US neutrality. From now on, it could only be a matter of time before America came to the rescue of the old world. Couldn't it?
Meanwhile, the Blitz went on, not only in London. On the night of November the 14th, 1940, in an operation called Moonlight Sonata, Coventry became a target too. It was the most intensive bombing raid the world had ever seen.
There was panic, hysteria, chaos. One woman wrote to her daughter, "Coventry is a city of the dead, utterly devastated."
They called it a reprisal. In return for the systematic bombing of military objectives by the Royal Air Force, German planes flew above the city of Coventry to broadcast death and destruction over the whole city.
Coventry lost a third of its houses, most of its ancient centre, and its cathedral. Other cities suffered terribly too. Merseyside, Tyneside, Birmingham, Bristol, Hull. In Clydebank, just 7 out of 8,000 houses were left untouched. In March 1941, Plymouth was gutted by 300 bombers in a 2-night assault.
Doreen Jessup was a 17-year-old ambulance driver who went into a Plymouth shelter just after a hit. There were all these people just sitting, she said. Some with children still on their laps, people with glasses and the glass still intact. Their hair lifeless and dusty. They were all dead, killed by the blast.
The taste of defeat was sapping confidence in Churchill's leadership. Some were pointing to Stalin's Russia, engaged in a bloody struggle against the Nazis since 1941, as an example of real fighting spirit. On the 23rd of October 1942, British Commonwealth forces were about to face their greatest test against the advancing German and Italian armies in North Africa. Between the two forces was a 5-mile-wide lethal strip, planted with 500,000 mines. It was known as the Devil's Gardens. Erwin Rommel, the German military commander in North Africa, was a dazzling strategist, famous across the world as the Desert Fox.
Even in Britain, Rommel became a kind of popular hero. Churchill said in the House of Commons he was a great general. But Churchill badly needed a victory.
The man entrusted to deliver it was a rather spiky, but occasionally brilliant general called Bernard Montgomery, better known as Monty.
Monty was an absolutely infuriating self-publicist. Just the kind of man for the new age of the celebrity general. He was said to be as quick as a ferret and about as likable. But he was a plain-speaking and charismatic leader who cajoled and hectored and inspired his men in a way no British general had ever done before. When he took over command of the 8th Army, or the Desert Rats, he told them there'll be no more belly aching and no more retreats.
At 21:40, the Battle of El Alamein began. With over 800 Allied artillery guns assaulting the German and Italian lines.
The first round of shelling lasted for 5.5 hours. It was the most intense artillery attack since the First World War, and the noise was so extreme that the gunners' ears poured with blood. Under cover of the bombardment, British troops began to pick their way forward on foot through the heavily mined desert to create an 8-yard-wide track along which the tank attack could begin. Heavy German fire meant that job of trying to clear a safe path was incredibly difficult and slow. The British tanks were becoming entangled in a sand-blown, bloody version of a London traffic jam. Back in London, Churchill was becoming angry and worried. Is it really impossible to find a general who can win a battle?
Montgomery knew he could afford to lose 2 or 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed, and that's exactly what he did. "25,000 Germans and Italians were killed, wounded or captured. On the 4th of November, Rommel began his retreat into Libya.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programme.
Back in Britain, the BBC news announcer was so excited he forgot the corporation's traditional neutrality.
Here's some excellent news which has come during the past hour. The Axis forces in the Western Desert are now in full retreat.
That'll show 'em. There's plenty more where that came from.
Victory moon.
Alamein was a great British victory, and it was a turning point. Churchill summed it up: this is not the end, it is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And he ordered the church bells to be rung across Britain. In many cases, the first time these bells had been rung since the war started. Later on, Churchill said, before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat.
Shine on, victory moon.
He must have been most tiresome to play tennis against, said Lady Moseley, but it amused me to watch. The he was a former Wimbledon player who would help Britain take the fight to the people of Germany. He was an abrasive Oxford physicist and Churchill's favourite scientist. Frederick Lindemann, known to friends as Prof.
Churchill loved having a boffin on hand. One of his favourite party tricks was to ask Lindemann to calculate the volume of champagne that Churchill had drunk in the course of his lifetime, and then to work out the effect of decanting all of that champagne into whatever room they happened to be sitting in at the time. Would it lap at their ankles? Would they be wading in it? Would they be entirely submerged?
Churchill made an occasional splash in Prof's home movies. Lindemann played doubles with Mrs. Churchill, and he always played to win.
Churchill used to say that Lindemann's brain was a wonderful piece of mechanism. And now that mechanism was tuned to destruction.
In March 1942, Lindemann sent a memo to Churchill based on his analysis of the effects of Nazi raids on Hull and Birmingham in 1940. He calculated that every 40 tons of bombs dropped by British bombers on German cities would make 4,000 to 8,000 Germans homeless. He concluded that there was little doubt that this would break the spirit of the people. At the start of the war, the RAF had tried to avoid civilian casualties. Lindemann was justifying a U-turn in bombing policy. His memo became known as the de-housing paper. Fellow scientist Henry Tizard had once been a great friend of Lindemann's. The de-housing paper provoked a fierce battle between them.
Tizard's opening salvo was a direct hit. I am afraid that I think the way you present the facts is extremely misleading. Lindemann hit back. Mass bombing was the only way to hit the enemy hard and to open up a second front to take pressure off the Russians. Tizard countered. I think, too, that you have got your facts wrong.
But Lindemann had Churchill's ear, and Britain now began diverting a huge proportion of her industrial resources into the bombing of German cities.
In fact, Lindemann seems to have deliberately distorted the statistics about the effects of German bombing on Hull and Birmingham. His de-housing memo fudged the numbers and overestimated what the bombers could achieve by around 600%. It was a piece of shabby evidence tweaking to lend authority to his dodgy dossier. And it would have horrendous consequences.
In February that year, Arthur "Bomber" Harris became head of Bomber Command. Like Lindemann, Harris believed fervently in terror bombing, but it came at a price. His crews would suffer worse losses than almost any other fighting force, and some of them called Harris simply Butcher. Arthur Harris was once stopped by a police constable for racing his Bentley at breakneck speed between his headquarters at High Wycombe and London. "You might have killed somebody, sir," said the constable. "Young man," replied Harris, "I kill thousands of people every night." On the nights of February the 13th and 14th, 1945, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe was the target. Dresden. The intensive bombing unleashed a firestorm. 25,000 people are believed to have suffocated or burned to death. It's estimated that 500,000 men, women and children were killed by British and American bombing in the course of the war. In his memoirs, Arthur Harris described the carpet bombing of Germany as a relatively humane method that saved the youth of this country from being mown down by the military as it was in the war of 1914 to 18. Now, there's no way of knowing those battles that the terror bombing avoided, nor whether it shortened the war at all. But what is certain is that it didn't break the spirit of the Germans any more than the Blitz broke the spirit of Britain.
Here is Larry Constantine, the world-famous cricketer. Larry used to be just a summer visitor, but when the war began, he became a welfare officer to the Ministry of Labor.
Hello, everybody. This is Larry Constantine.
War is in the air, all West Indians will do their share.
In July 1943, the man who helped the West Indies win their first test matches against England came down to London from his home in Lancashire.
They cheer, they will fight. Fighter never fear, victory is near.
He'd booked a room at the Imperial Hotel in Russell Square. But when he and his family arrived, the manager told them they could stay one night, but no longer.
On to victory.
Larry Constantine refused to budge. His boss at the Ministry of Labour, Arnold Watson, arrived and asked what was going on. "We can't have these niggers in our hotel," said the manager. "He can stay tonight, but he has to go tomorrow morning." When Watson demanded to know her reasons, she replied, "Because of the Americans." By the spring of 1944, 1.5 million Americans were in Britain preparing to liberate Europe. About 130,000 of them were black. America in the 1940s still had racial segregation. US military police were supposed to enforce laws keeping blacks and whites from socializing together, but it wasn't easy. There were flashpoints, pub brawls, even shootings. Despite their attachment to segregation, the Yanks were convinced they were bringing democracy as well as military aid to a quaintly class-bound Britain. The GIs certainly looked like the future. They were taller, louder, better dressed and richer. They had chocolate and cigarettes in their pocket and plenty of money for the pubs and clubs. But they brought with them from America things that were worth more than the money. Millions of condoms and razor blades and stockings. Their comics were passed from hand to hand until they became ragged, and their slang spread like a fever.
Well, this looks like an interesting corner. Hiya, babe. What you doing tonight?
Fire watching. What are you having?
You're really a hip tomato. I'll have a slug of bourbon.
Not surprisingly, all this went down badly with British soldiers, with their sparse pay packets and their baggier, browner, dowdier uniforms, as wives and girlfriends ogled something better.
Guess I better blow.
And there was a lot of ogling going on. A young Canadian soldier wrote in his diary, "A lot of men were going to die. Everyone knew that Hyde Park and Green Park at dusk and after dark were a vast battlefield of sex."
If sex was the battlefield, Piccadilly Circus was the front line. In the near absolute darkness of the blackout, the prostitutes of London would light matches or shine torches on their faces and then down towards their stockings and high heels. They were known as the Piccadilly Commandos. The Sunday pictorial newspaper described the mile around Piccadilly Circus as a spider's web of vice.
Hello, darling. You like my little dog, yes?
No.
And at the heart of it all was Rainbow Corner, headquarters of the American Red Cross in the West End.
Here at Rainbow Corner, there was a barber shop, hot showers, ice cream sodas, a shoe-shine parlour and a jukebox. There was a basement called Dunker's Den, where you could devour donuts and coffee and much else.
Fraternization on the dance floor and off it. See what I mean?
It was a hive of 24-hour-a-day, all-American action.
This was where the goods and attitudes from the United States that would later colonize the world first arrived in Britain. The Americans invaded us right there.
The 17th of November, 1943. A village postman in Dorset is doing his rounds. Today, he's taking the same letter to every house.
The letter from Major General C.H. Miller was an eviction notice. In order to give our troops the fullest opportunity to perfect their training in the use of modern warfare, the Army must have an area of ground particularly suited to their special needs. That area of ground included the little parish of Tyneham, whose villagers were given 28 days to pack up and go.
Evacuation in the path of war has come to the peaceful southwest of England. Not the feverish exit from an enemy invader, but an orderly removal out of cottages, farms and village stores.
Tyneham really was Old England. Some of the villagers had never even left for a day trip to the nearest town, never mind going to live somewhere else. But Old England was also intensely patriotic.
Bessie and Helen Taylor were hanging out the washing when the postman came with the eviction letter.
Helen Taylor said later, "We loved Tyneham, but we also loved our country. And if it was our duty to leave for the war effort, so be it."
Some villagers were hoping to be back for the harvest in May. They would never return. Tyneham remains a military training area to this day.
Invasion stretched its long lines of tanks and guns and vehicles down the rolling English roads.
Times have certainly changed since those days when invasion implied invasion of Britain.
By April 1944, southern England had become one vast military camp. The greatest invasion force in history was preparing for battle. The location and timing of the attack had become the most crucial secret of the war. On June the 6th, 1944, German troops finally faced the surprise assault on 5 Normandy beaches by American, British and Canadian forces. D-Day.
And so the secret, the most important secret, held. The Germans were caught off guard. But this was still a horrendously dangerous operation. The huge Allied armada was limited by the size of the landing craft and the size of the beaches. In the first wave of the attack, only 9 Allied divisions could reach France, where they would be confronted by 58 German divisions.
After news of the heroic landings, the liberating army's advances were frustratingly slow.
The Germans fought cleverly and bravely and hard. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, the Allied armies never had it easy.
May the 4th, 1945. On Lüneburg Heath, 5 German officers surrender the German armies of the North. The war is over.
When victory in Europe finally came, the people's joy knew no bounds. But afterwards, the full horror of the war dawned. The British people were waking up to a new world order. And there'd be little room for a British Empire, or even an independent British voice in the post-war world.
Britannia's imperial red-jacketed adventurers had become the crumpled, relieved Bolshevik democracy of the VE Day celebrations. And even as the people cheered and an excited young Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, mingled anonymously with the crowd, one of the least likely empires in the history of the world was dying.
Just 44 years after the death of Queen Victoria, Imperial Britannia's final flare was her finest hour. She'd faced down defeat, destruction and death, and the British people had refused to fall apart.
Instead, they came together in a way they'd never really done before and sacrificed dreams and homes and lives to keep hope alive around the world until the final victory came. And by doing all of that, they made modern Britain. And then they gave it to us.
There's a land of begin again, and there's not a cloud.
And that was the final part of the making of modern Britain. Never mind the Buzzcocks is over on BBC Two now, and here on BBC HD, there's fabulous drama with The Curse of Steptoe.
Goodbye.